Struggling rancher rescued a starving boy. Unaware the child was the banker's hidden heir, he found the boy dying by his well, bones showing through torn clothes. Not knowing this starving child would either save his ranch or destroy everything he'd worked. The autumn wind tasted of endings. Samuel Hayes stood on his front porch, watching dust devils dance across land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. The Hayes brand had once marked 500 head of cattle. Now it marked nothing but memories and mortgage papers that rustled like dry leaves in his coat pocket. The sun hung low and mean over the empty pastures, casting long shadows that seemed to point toward the banker's office in town. 3 weeks. That's what Jonathan Whitmore had given him. 3 weeks to find money that didn't exist, to pay debts that had grown fat, while his cattle grew thin and finally disappeared altogether. Samuel's hands, rough as leather and twice as worn, gripped the porch railing. These same hands had delivered calves in spring storms, mended fence in summer heat, and counted coins that never seemed to multiply the way his father had promised they would. The land was supposed to provide. That's what his father had said, and his father's father before him. But the land had turned stingy, and the rains had forgotten their way to this corner of Texas. Inside the house, Clara moved through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned to make something from nothing. The smell of cornbread drifted through the open window, thin and careful, the kind of meal that stretched flour until it screamed. They'd been married 15 years, and in all that time, Clara had never complained. Not when the good years turned lean, not when the lean years turned desperate, not even when they had to sell her mother's silver spoons to buy seed that failed to grow. Samuel pulled the letter from his pocket again, though he knew every word by heart. The bank's official seal seemed to mock him, all proper and legal while his world crumbled like old adobe. Final notice, it said, as if there had been hope in the notices that came before. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and desperation. It was then that Samuel saw him. A small figure stumbled across the yard, moving with the uncertain gait of someone who had forgotten how to trust his own legs. The boy, and it was clearly a boy, though so thin he might have been made of twigs and shadows, collapsed near the well, his small body folding in on itself like a broken bird. Samuel was moving before he'd made the conscious decision to do so. His boots struck the dry earth in steady rhythm as he crossed the yard, each step bringing the boy's condition into sharper, more heartbreaking focus. The child's clothes hung in tatters, more holes than fabric. His arms were thin as kindling, and when Samuel knelt beside him, he could count every rib through the boy's torn shirt. "Son," Samuel's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Son, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes fluttered open, brown as creek water, and just as deep. They held a kind of weariness that no child should carry, the look of someone who had seen too much and eaten too little. His lips moved, but no sound came out except the whisper of air through a throat too dry for words. Samuel slipped his arms under the boy's slight frame, shocked at how little he weighed. The child felt like nothing at all, as if he were made of dust and wishes. Clara appeared at Samuel's shoulder, her face pale but determined. "Bring him inside," she said, her voice steady despite the worry that creased her brow. "I'll heat some broth." They laid the boy on the kitchen table, Clara's gentle hands checking for fever while Samuel pumped water from the indoor well. The boy's eyes followed their movements with a mixture of gratitude and wariness, like a wild animal unsure whether these humans meant help or harm. Clara spooned small amounts of water between his cracked lips, murmuring soft encouragements that seemed to come from some deep well of maternal instinct. The boy drank carefully, as if he'd learned the hard way that too much too fast could bring more pain than pleasure. "What's your name, child?" Clara asked, her voice soft as Sunday morning. The boy's mouth moved, but only a whisper emerged, "Hungry." Samuel and Clara exchanged glances over the boy's head. It wasn't an answer to her question, but it was truth in its purest form. Clara ladled thin broth into a bowl, the steam rising like prayers in the lamp. She fed him slowly, one spoonful at a time, while Samuel studied the child's face. There was something there beyond the hunger and exhaustion, an intelligence that watched and measured, even in weakness. "Where did you come from?" Samuel asked gently. The boy's eyes grew distant, as if he were looking at something far beyond the kitchen walls. "From the hungry place," he whispered. Samuel felt Clara's hand find his across the table. They were poor, poorer than they'd ever been, but they weren't heartless. This boy had wandered into their yard like an answer to a prayer they hadn't known they were praying. As the evening wore on, the boy managed to eat half a bowl of broth and a small piece of cornbread. Color began to return to his cheeks, though he remained thin as a fence post. Clara found an old shirt that had belonged to Samuel as a child, faded but clean, and helped the boy change out of his tattered clothes. "You can sleep in a barn," Samuel said, not unkindly. "It's warm, and there's fresh hay." The boy nodded, his eyes already heavy with the kind of exhaustion that comes from running on empty for too long. Samuel walked with him to the barn, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The boy settled into the hay like a small animal finding its nest, and Samuel left the lantern burning low beside him. Walking back to the house, Samuel paused in the yard and looked up at the stars. They seemed brighter tonight, though he couldn't say why. In his pocket, the bank letter crinkled with each step, reminding him that kindness was a luxury he could ill afford. Clara was waiting for him in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had been stretched thin with chicory. "We can't keep him," she said quietly. "I know," Samuel replied, though his heart argued otherwise. "We barely have enough for ourselves." "I know." Clara studied her husband's face in the lamplight, reading the conflict there like words on a page. "But we can't turn him out either." Samuel sat down beside her, his own hands finding the warmth of his coffee cup. Outside, the wind continued its restless dance across the empty pastures, carrying with it the whispers of change. "Maybe," he said finally, "sometimes doing the right thing doesn't have to make sense." Clara nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared secret. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had learned that love sometimes meant making room when there was no room to make, sharing when there was nothing left to share. Tomorrow would bring its own problems, its own impossible choices. But tonight there was a boy sleeping in their barn, and for the first time in months, their home felt less empty. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles, while in the barn, a small chest rose and fell with the rhythm of peaceful sleep, and in the house, two hearts wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. The starving boy they rescued proved smarter than any child should. He knew cattle prices, understood banking, and spoke of money like he'd been born to it. 3 weeks had passed since the boy appeared at their well, and Thomas, as he'd finally whispered his name, had become part of the ranch's rhythm like sunrise and sunset. Samuel watched him now, small hands steady as he mended a section of fence that had been broken since spring. The boy worked with a quiet intensity that reminded Samuel of himself at that age, when every task carried the weight of survival. But there was something else in Thomas's movements, a precision that spoke of training, of lessons learned in places far removed from ranch work. "Hand me that wire," Samuel said, and Thomas passed it over without looking up, his attention focused on the fence post he was working to straighten. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pasture, empty now except for memories and the occasional tumble of wind-blown grass. Samuel had sold the last of his cattle 6 months ago, but Thomas worked as if the herd might return any moment, fixing fence with the same care Samuel's father had taught him. "Why are you fixing fence with no cattle to keep in?" Thomas asked, his voice still carrying the careful cadence of someone who chose words like stepping stones across a dangerous creek. Samuel paused, his hands stilling on the wire. It was a fair question, one he'd asked himself more than once. "Because," he said finally, "this land will see cattle again someday. And when it does, the fence needs to be ready." Thomas nodded, understanding passing between them like shared breath. The boy had learned something about hope in his short life, though whether it had served him well or poorly remained a mystery written in the careful way he held his shoulders. Back at the house, Clara's voice drifted through the open kitchen window as she worked Thomas through his letters. She'd taken to teaching him in the afternoons, using her father's old Bible and whatever scraps of paper she could find. The boy learned with a hunger that went beyond mere curiosity. He devoured words like a man drinking after crossing the desert. Sound it out, Clara's gentle voice encouraged. Therefore whosoever heareth these sayings of mine. Samuel smiled despite the weight in his chest. Clara had always wanted children, but the years had passed without blessing them in that way. Now, watching her bend over the kitchen table with Thomas, her finger tracing words across the page, Samuel saw a completeness in her face that had been missing for too long. The sound of hoofbeats broke through his thoughts, and Samuel looked up to see 3 riders approaching along the dirt road. His stomach tightened as he recognized the lead horse, a fine bay gelding that belonged to the bank. Jonathan Whitmore rode with the careful posture of a man who never forgot his own importance, flanked by 2 men whose faces Samuel didn't recognize, but whose purpose was clear in the way they sat their saddles. Thomas had stopped working and stood frozen beside the fence, his face pale as morning frost. Samuel noticed the boy's hands tremble slightly before he clenched them into fists, and something cold settled in Samuel's gut. "Go inside," Samuel said quietly. "Help Clara with the washing." But Thomas didn't move, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders with an intensity that made Samuel's chest tighten. The boy's breathing had gone shallow, and Samuel could see him calculating distances to the house, to the barn, like prey measuring escape routes. "Thomas," Samuel said more firmly. "Go on now." This time the boy obeyed, but not before Samuel caught something in his expression. Not just fear, but recognition. The kind of look that came from knowing exactly who was riding toward them and why. Whitmore reined in his horse 20 feet from where Samuel stood, close enough to talk, but far enough to maintain the distance that power required. The banker was a tall man with silver hair and eyes like winter sky, dressed in clothes that cost more than Samuel made in a good year. "Hayes," Whitmore said by way of greeting, his voice carrying the neutral tone of business. "I trust you received my letter." "I did," Samuel replied, not moving from beside the fence. And Samuel's hands found the fence post, drawing strength from the solid wood beneath his palms. "I'm working on it." Whitmore's smile was thin as paper and twice as cutting. "Working on it." He looked around the empty pasture, taking in the repaired fence, the tidy yard, the small signs of care that marked the place as loved despite its poverty. "I see you've taken in a stray." Samuel's jaw tightened. Through the kitchen window, he could see Thomas standing beside Clara, both of them still as statues. Boy needed help. Interesting. Whitmore's gaze lingered on the house. Young Thomas looked familiar. Reminds me of someone. The cold in Samuel's gut spread outward like spilled water. Beside Whitmore, one of the other men, a thin, sharp-faced individual with eyes like a hawk, leaned forward in his saddle. "That's him," the man said quietly. "That's the boy." Samuel felt the world shift beneath his feet like loose sand, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." Whitmore studied Samuel with the patience of a cat watching a mouse hole. "No, I don't suppose you do." He gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "You have 10 days, Hayes. 10 days to settle your account, or we'll be back with papers that carry more weight than requests." The 3 men turned their horses and rode away, leaving Samuel standing beside his mended fence with questions multiplying in his mind like storm clouds. Inside the house, Clara's voice had resumed the lesson, but Samuel could hear the strain in it, the careful control that came from performing normalcy while the world threatened to crack apart. That evening, after a supper of beans and cornbread eaten in unusually quiet company, Samuel found Thomas in the barn. The boy sat in the hay, turning over a piece of smooth wood in his hands, a toy horse that Samuel had carved for him the week before. "You know them," Samuel said. It wasn't a question. Thomas's hands stilled on the wooden horse. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the barn walls and the distant cry of a night bird. "I know them," Thomas admitted finally, his voice small in the gathering darkness. Samuel settled himself in the hay beside the boy, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to give him space to speak. "Want to tell me about it?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Samuel began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slow and careful, like a man crossing a frozen river. "My mama used to say that some people measure everything by what it's worth in money," Thomas said. "She said that was a sad way to live, because some things don't have prices." Samuel waited, understanding that pushing would only drive the boy deeper into silence. "Before the hunger," Thomas continued, "I lived in a big house with thick carpets and windows tall as trees. There were servants and fine food and books, so many books. But nobody talked about things that mattered. They talked about numbers and percentages and investments." The wooden horse turned over and over in Thomas's small hands, catching occasional glints of starlight through the barn's open door. "When my parents died, I went to live with someone who thought children should be seen but not heard, who thought love was something you earned by being useful." Thomas's voice grew smaller. "I wasn't very useful." Samuel felt his chest tighten with understanding. "So you ran." "I ran," Thomas confirmed, "and I kept running until I couldn't run anymore. Until I found your well." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Finally, Samuel spoke. "Those numbers you know, cattle prices, bank interest, the way you look at our account books like you understand them, that's not knowledge a boy picks up running." Thomas nodded, his shoulders sagging as if a weight had settled on them. "My grandfather is Jonathan Whitmore." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel felt pieces clicking into place. The boy's intelligence, his careful manners, the way Whitmore had looked at him with something like recognition. "He's the one looking for you. He's the one I ran from." Thomas's voice carried the weight of old pain. "He put me in that orphanage after Mama and Papa died. Said I needed discipline, needed to learn my place. But the place he wanted me to learn wasn't with people who cared about me." Samuel's hands clenched in the hay. The thought of this boy, this gentle, intelligent child, locked away in some cold institution, made his blood burn. "Does Clara know?" Thomas shook his head. "Just you now." Samuel looked out at the stars, bright and distant as promises that might never be kept. In 10 days, Whitmore would return with foreclosure papers. But now Samuel understood that the banker wasn't just coming for the ranch. He was coming for Thomas, too. "What do you want to do?" Samuel asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his small fingers tracing the mane of the wooden horse. "I want to stay," he whispered finally. "I want to help you save the ranch. I want to learn to be the kind of man who fixes fence even when there's no cattle to keep in." Samuel felt something shift in his chest, like the first crack in winter ice. "Then that's what we'll figure out how to do." The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles, while in the barn, a man and a boy sat side by side, bound together by secrets and the quiet determination to protect what they'd found in each other. The banker arrived to foreclose on their ranch, but when he saw the boy they'd rescued, his voice broke with one word: "William, my grandson." The morning of the 10th day dawned clear and merciless, the kind of day that offered no clouds to soften the sun's judgment. Samuel stood on his porch, watching dust rise on the horizon like smoke signals spelling out his fate. 3 riders approached with the steady inevitability of time itself, and Samuel knew his reprieve had ended. Beside him, Thomas pressed close to Clara's side, his small hand gripping hers with the desperate strength of someone preparing to be torn away. The boy had barely spoken since sunrise, his face pale as winter sky, but his jaw held the same stubborn set Samuel had seen in his own mirror during hard times. "Whatever happens," Clara murmured, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "we love you. Remember that." Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Samuel placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the bird-like fragility of bones beneath worn cotton. 10 days they'd had together as a family, And now those days felt both eternal and fleeting as morning frost. The riders drew closer, their horses' hooves beating a steady rhythm against the hard pack. Jonathan Whitmore rode in the center, flanked by two men whose faces carried the grim satisfaction of undertakers arriving for a funeral. One carried a leather satchel that Samuel knew contained papers with the power to strip away everything his family had built. Whitmore reined in his mount 20 feet from the porch, his pale eyes taking in the scene with calculating precision. He was dressed in a fine black suit that seemed to absorb the morning light, his silver hair swept back beneath a hat worth more than Samuel's remaining livestock. When his gaze fell upon Thomas, something flickered across his features, recognition, surprise, and something that might have been relief. "Hayes," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the neutral tone of business conducted at a comfortable distance. "I trust you have our payment ready." Samuel's hand tightened on Thomas's shoulder. "You know I don't." Indeed, Whitmore's attention had already shifted to the boy at Clara's side. "Then we proceed, as previously discussed." He paused, his head tilting slightly. "Though I confess, your foundling looks remarkably familiar." Thomas stepped forward then, away from Clara's protective embrace, his chin raised with a courage that made Samuel's chest tighten with pride and fear in equal measure. "Hello, grandfather." The word fell into the morning air like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled group. Whitmore's carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing something raw and complicated beneath. "William," Whitmore breathed, his voice losing its businesslike precision. "My God, William, we've searched everywhere. Where have you been?" "Thomas." William stood straighter, his young voice carrying a steadiness that belied his years. "I've been here. I've been home." Whitmore dismounted with movements sharp as breaking glass, his boots striking the ground with the authority of a man accustomed to having the earth itself bend to his will. "Home." His laugh held no warmth. "Child, your home is in Dallas, with tutors and proper clothes and the education befitting your station. Not this." He gestured dismissively at the modest ranch house, the mended fence, the careful signs of a life lived close to the bone. "This is where I belong," Thomas said quietly, moving closer to Samuel and Clara. "These people fed me when I was starving. They taught me to read. They fixed the fence even though they have no cattle because they believe the cattle will come back someday." Whitmore's face hardened into the expression Samuel had seen him wear in the bank. The look of a man calculating profit and loss, measuring everything against the cold standard of dollars and cents. "Sentiment is a luxury, William. These people are about to lose everything they own. Their kindness, while touching, changes nothing about their circumstances." Samuel felt Clara's hand find his arm, her fingers gripping tight enough to leave marks. He understood now why Thomas had run, why he preferred starvation to the cold comfort of his grandfather's care. Whitmore spoke of love the way other men spoke of business transactions, as if affection were something to be earned through proper behavior and careful accounting. "Mr. Whitmore," Clara said, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained Samuel through 15 years of marriage and hardship. "That boy, Thomas, he's been with us for weeks now. He's part of our family." Whitmore's pale eyes fixed on Clara with the patience of a man explaining simple mathematics to a child. "Mrs. Hayes, William is my grandson, my sole heir. His parents died in a carriage accident last spring, leaving him in my care. When he disappeared from the Mercy Home for Children, I feared the worst." "The Mercy Home," Thomas said, the words bitter as alkali water, "where children learn mercy by receiving none. Where children learn discipline and proper values," Whitmore corrected sharply. "Where they're prepared for the responsibilities that come with wealth and position." Samuel had heard enough. He stepped forward, placing himself between Whitmore and the boy, his weathered hands steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "With respect, sir, seems to me that boys learn plenty about responsibility right here. He mends fence, tends animals, helps with chores without being asked. He reads from the Bible with my wife every evening and says grace at every meal with gratitude that comes from knowing what it means to be truly hungry. How touching, Whitmore said, his voice carrying the cutting edge of winter wind. But William's education requires more than farm labor and Bible verses. He needs to understand banking, investment, the management of substantial holdings. He needs to learn to lead men, not follow them around fixing fences that serve no purpose. Thomas moved then, stepping out from behind Samuel with the kind of quiet courage that made grown men take notice. "Understand banking," he said, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "I know that compound interest can destroy a man's life as surely as drought or disease. I know that some debts are measured in money, and others are measured in kindness received when none was owed." Whitmore stared at his grandson, something like surprise flickering across his controlled features. "You speak well for a child who's been living like a vagrant." "I speak like someone who's learned the difference between being rich and being wealthy," Thomas replied. "Between having money and having family." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, threatening to snap under the weight of all the words left unspoken. Samuel felt Clara's hand slip into his, her palm warm and steady against his work-roughened fingers. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Whitmore reached into his coat and withdrew a leather folder thick with documents. "William, you are my grandson and my heir. When I die, you will inherit holdings worth more than this entire county. But wealth requires preparation, discipline, education that cannot be found in." He gestured again at the ranch with barely concealed distaste. "What if I don't want it?" Thomas asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Whitmore's face went very still, and Samuel could practically see the man's mind working through possibilities he had never considered. "Don't want it," Whitmore repeated, as if the words made no sense in any language he understood. "What if I want to stay here and learn to raise cattle and fix fence and read from the Bible with Clara in the evenings?" Thomas's voice grew stronger with each word. "What if I want to be part of a family that chooses me because they love me, not because they have to?" Whitmore's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Child, love doesn't pay debts. Love doesn't build empires or secure futures. Love is—" He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to express his disdain. "Love is what poor people tell themselves matters when they have nothing else." Samuel felt something inside him catch fire at those words. He'd lived his whole life poor by Whitmore standards, but he'd never felt lacking in the things that truly mattered. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd learned hard truths through harder experience. "I've been poor most of my life, and I've never once thought love was something I settled for because I couldn't afford better." Clara squeezed his hand, and Samuel drew strength from her touch. "This boy came to us hungry and frightened, and we fed him because it was right. We taught him because he was eager to learn. We love him because love grows where it's tended, like crops in good soil. You want to take him back to that orphanage because you think money can buy what family gives freely." Whitmore's face flushed with anger, but beneath the anger, Samuel caught a glimpse of something else. Uncertainty, perhaps even pain. "Mr. Hayes, you speak of things you don't understand. William's inheritance comes with responsibilities that extend far beyond personal preference. There are businesses to run, people depending on decisions he will someday make. Romance is a luxury that few can afford." "Then maybe," Thomas said quietly, "the problem isn't that I need to learn to live with money. Maybe the problem is that money has learned to live without." The words fell into the morning stillness like stones into deep water. Whitmore stared at his grandson with an expression Samuel couldn't quite read, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he had lost long ago. One of Whitmore's companions cleared his throat impatiently. "Sir, the papers." Whitmore held up a hand for silence, his attention fixed entirely on Thomas. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its edge. "William, I've spent months searching for you. Months believing you might be dead. Do you have any idea what that did to me? Thomas met his grandfather's gaze steadily. Do you have any idea what it did to me, believing that nobody would search? The pain in those words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He saw it register on Whitmore's face, too, a crack in the armor of certainty that had carried him through decades of business dealings. I searched, Whitmore said quietly. I hired men, offered rewards. You searched for your heir, Thomas replied. Not for your grandson. There's a difference. Samuel watched the two of them, the old man in his expensive suit and the boy in his carefully mended clothes, and saw himself reflected in both. The stubborn pride, the refusal to bend, the deep well of pain that came from loving people who couldn't or wouldn't love you back the way you needed. What do you propose? Whitmore asked finally, his voice careful as a man testing the strength of thin ice. Thomas looked up at Samuel and Clara, drawing strength from their presence. I propose that love and money don't have to be enemies. I propose that maybe a boy can learn about banking and still know the value of mending fence. Maybe he can prepare for inheritance and still understand that some things can't be bought or sold. Samuel held his breath, understanding that the next few moments would reshape all their lives. Whitmore stood silent, his pale eyes moving between his grandson and the people who had become the boy's chosen family. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows, while 4 adults and 1 remarkable boy waited to learn whether love and duty could find common ground in the dust and silence of a failing ranch. The boy had to choose between a grandfather's fortune and a poor family's love. His decision would change more lives than anyone imagined. The sun hung suspended in the morning sky like a brass coin, casting everything in shades of gold and shadow, while 4 adults and 1 boy stood balanced on the edge of decisions that would echo through generations. Jonathan Whitmore had been silent for long minutes, his pale eyes moving between his grandson and the couple who had claimed him. Samuel could see the calculation happening behind those eyes, the careful weighing of duty against desire, tradition against the unexpected variables that love always introduced into the cleanest equations. There is, Whitmore said finally, his voice careful as a man testing the strength of rope, perhaps a solution that serves all interests. Thomas stepped closer to Clara, his small hand finding hers with the instinctive trust of a child who had learned to recognize safety in simple gestures. What kind of solution? Whitmore looked around the ranch with eyes that seemed to be seeing it for the first time, really seeing it, not just cataloging its deficiencies against some mental ledger of worth. The mended fence, the tidy yard, the small garden where Clara grew vegetables with stubborn hope despite the dry season. His gaze lingered on the house itself, modest but solid, built to last by hands that understood the value of work done right. You speak of learning both worlds, Whitmore said to Thomas. Banking and fence mending. Inheritance and family. The last word came out strained, as if he were speaking a language he'd almost forgotten. Perhaps such learning requires a broader classroom than I had previously considered. Samuel felt Clara's grip tighten on his arm, both of them afraid to hope, afraid to breathe too deeply lest they disturb whatever delicate possibility was taking shape in the morning air. The ranch is failing, Whitmore continued, his businessman's voice returning, but somehow gentler than before. Poor management, unfortunate weather, the usual catalog of small disasters that accumulate into large catastrophes. But the land itself is sound. The water rights are secure. With proper investment, proper guidance. You want to buy the ranch, Samuel said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn like sunrise over distant mountains. I want to ensure my grandson has the education he claims to desire, Whitmore replied. All of it. The practical lessons these good people can provide, and the formal education his inheritance requires. If William, Thomas, wishes to learn both worlds, then perhaps both worlds must be made available to him. Thomas looked up at Samuel and Clara, his brown eyes bright with something that might have been hope. Would that mean I could stay? It would mean, Whitmore said carefully, that you would divide your time. Summer's here, learning what Mr. and Mrs. Hayes have to teach. Winter's in Dallas, attending proper schools, learning the business that will someday be yours to manage. It would mean that when you come of age, you'll be equipped to choose your path with full knowledge of both options. Samuel felt the world shift beneath his feet, but this time the movement felt like settling rather than collapse. And the ranch would become profitable again, Whitmore said. I would purchase the existing debt, invest in improvements, ensure proper management. You would run it as you see fit, with resources adequate to make it successful. He paused, his eyes finding Thomas again. And you would continue to provide the kind of education that apparently cannot be found in any formal classroom. Clara stepped forward then, her voice steady despite the emotion Samuel could see gathering in her eyes. Mr. Whitmore, with respect, what you're proposing sounds generous. But Thomas isn't property to be managed or investment to be diversified. He's a child who needs love, consistency, people who choose him every day not because they have to, but because they want to. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the woman who had become grandmother to his grandson in the space of weeks. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from some deep place he rarely allowed others to see. Mrs. Hayes, I have spent the months since William disappeared asking myself, what kind of man loses his only grandchild to an institution meant to provide safety? What kind of grandfather fails so completely that a boy chooses starvation over staying under his protection? He looked down at his polished boots, dust already beginning to dim their shine. I told myself it was about discipline, about preparing him for responsibilities he was born to carry. But watching him these past few minutes, seeing the way he stands close to you both, the confidence in his voice when he speaks of family. Whitmore's words trailed off, but Samuel understood. The old man was seeing his grandson truly for the first time, not as heir or obligation, but as a child who had found what he'd been seeking in the most unlikely place. Thomas moved then, walking slowly toward his grandfather with the careful steps of someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt or bite. When he reached Whitmore, he stood very straight, his young voice carrying a gravity that made the adults around him hold their breath. Grandfather, he said quietly, I want to learn about the business. I want to understand the responsibilities that come with the name I carry. But I also want to learn about the kind of wealth that can't be counted in banks or measured in land holdings. I want to learn how to be the kind of man who helps people instead of just managing them. Whitmore looked down at his grandson, and Samuel saw something crack in the older man's carefully controlled expression. And you believe you can learn that here? Thomas nodded, his small hand reaching out to touch his grandfather's arm with the kind of gentle courage that Samuel had come to recognize as the boy's particular gift. I believe I can learn it from people who've already figured out how to be rich in the things that matter most. And maybe, he added, his voice growing softer, maybe you could learn it too. The silence that followed felt different from the tense quiet that had preceded it. This was the silence of possibility, of doors opening rather than closing, of hearts making room where they thought no room existed. Whitmore knelt down then, bringing himself to Thomas's eye level with movements careful as prayer. William, Thomas, I have made mistakes. Significant ones. I thought love was something that interfered with proper planning, that sentiment was weakness that successful men couldn't afford. But watching you choose people who had nothing to offer you except care and kindness, perhaps I've been measuring success with the wrong instruments. Thomas stepped closer, his small arms wrapping around his grandfather's neck with the trust that children offer to adults brave enough to deserve it. Maybe we can learn together, he whispered. Samuel felt Clara's hand slip into his, her fingers warm and steady as they watched 3 generations begin to heal wounds that had seemed too deep for mending. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the night's chill, and Samuel found himself thinking about seeds planted in barren ground. How sometimes the most unlikely soil produced the strongest growth. There will be conditions, Whitmore said when he and Thomas finally stepped apart, though his voice had lost its edge of demand. Formal education during the school year. Proper preparation for the responsibilities that come with inheritance. And regular reports on your progress in both worlds. And Samuel prompted, sensing there was more. Whitmore's smile was small but real, the first genuine expression Samuel had seen from him. And Sunday dinners. Here, at this table with this family. Because it occurs to me that I've forgotten how to be a grandfather. It seems foolish to waste the opportunity to learn from people who've mastered the art of being family. Clara laughed then, a sound bright as spring water after a long drought. Mr. Whitmore, I believe that could be arranged. The papers came out then, different papers than the foreclosure documents Whitmore had arrived with. Investment agreements, educational trusts, arrangements that spoke of futures built together rather than torn apart. Samuel signed his name with hands steady as the ground beneath his feet, understanding that he was not giving up his ranch, but gaining partners in the work of raising more than cattle. As the sun reached its zenith, Whitmore and his men prepared to leave, but the departure felt like beginning rather than ending. Thomas would go with them, not as prisoner or property, but as grandson finally claimed and claiming in return. He would attend school in Dallas through the winter, but summer would bring him home to the ranch, to fence mending and Bible reading and the quiet lessons that Clara and Samuel had learned to teach. Samuel stood on his porch watching the dust settle behind the departing riders, Thomas's small figure visible between his grandfather and the promise of a future none of them could have imagined weeks before. Clara joined him, her arms slipping around his waist with the comfortable ease of years spent weathering storms together. "Think it'll work?" she asked. Samuel looked out at his empty pastures, but now he could see them as they would be, filled again with cattle, prosperity earned through work and patience, and the kind of wealth that multiplied when shared. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes the best crops grow in ground that's been broken first." The wind moved through the grass, carrying with it the scent of rain still days away, but coming nonetheless. In the distance, a hawk circled in the thermal currents, riding the air with patient grace. Samuel watched it soar, thinking about how some things that seemed impossible at ground level became clear when viewed from the proper height. That evening, as Clara prepared supper in a kitchen that felt both empty and full of promise, Samuel walked out to check the fence Thomas had helped him mend. The work was solid, built to last, ready for whatever came next. He smiled, understanding finally that this was what hope looked like, not the bright flash of sudden fortune, but the steady work of preparing for better days, trusting that seeds planted with love would find their way to light. Above him, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, bright and distant as promises that stretched across generations. Somewhere in Dallas, a boy was learning to balance two worlds, carrying with him the lessons of a ranch where love grew in unlikely soil. And here, in the quiet of evening settling over healing land, a man and woman held each other close and dreamed of summer days when their chosen son would come home.